So everyone, I'm Rachel Jacobs and I'm here in Gadigal land on the Eora Nation, which is Sydney, Australia. And I am a teaching artist. I'm also a lecturer at Western Sydney University. I'm a dancer and a choreographer, and I am one of the facilitators of today. I'll pass over to Carla for an introduction now.
Hello, everybody. My name is Carla Estela Rivera. I am tuning in from Chicago, Illinois, which is the unceded lands of the Odawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations, among other Indigenous communities here in the United States and in the Midwest. I also want to acknowledge and bring in my Taino ancestry from Puerto Rico, which is where I was born, and I bring all of that with me. I am a writer, a performer, a theater practitioner, and I am the executive director of the Arts Administrators of Color here in the United States, where we build network and do advocacy work and other activities that grow and support artists and arts administrators of the global majority across the United States. So happy to be here, and I'm going to pass it over to Rachel Dwyer.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Dwyer. I am on the Sunshine Coast in Australia on beautiful Kabi Kabi country, and I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging, acknowledging that I am a descendant of the original colonizers of this land. It's land that was never ceded, always will be Aboriginal land.
Thank you very much to my colleagues. If we'll move to the next slide. Thank you everyone who is commenting in the chat. We are being joined from all over the world. I believe we have so many continents mentioned in the chat box. And I also appreciate a number of people who have mentioned the traditional owners, the unceded of the unceded lands that they are on. And we'll pause at this moment. We are talking anti-racist practice in the arts and in teaching artistry. And there is no racial justice without First Nations justice. We have made land acknowledgements, and Carla and Rachel have beautifully demonstrated how to do those. I am sitting on Gadigal land in the Eora Nation, as I've mentioned, where sovereignty was never ceded. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'd also like to acknowledge that, that the arts and teaching the arts and living and being through the arts has taken place on this land for thousands and thousands of years. And the degradation of the arts began with colonisation. So we have a link over here, and it's also in our reading list, that tells you a little bit about land acknowledgements, why they're done, and how you might approach doing a land acknowledgement yourself. It is a good idea to practice if it's not something that you've done before. And I'll hand over to Rachel, who'll give us a little bit of background about land acknowledgements as well.
So I was reflecting on the context of land acknowledgements. Land acknowledgements are often seen as a first step, but kind of if that's as far as it goes, then it's not enough. Like, this is in some ways a token gesture. It's a starting point. And there is certainly where I come from, a tradition of welcoming to country, was that if you were moving from from your own land to another, or you're moving from place to place, then there was a requirement to go to a meeting place and wait to be welcomed, to be given permission to move onto country. And so the idea of acknowledging whose land we're on kind of is an extension of that tradition, as people were expected to be welcomed to country as they move between different countries. So it's not just that it's a token gesture, but it sort of connects with some pre-colonial practices in this country anyway. But I think it's important that the whole point of this is to know where you're on, to think about that and the practices of that the owners of unceded land, of who've cared for land long before any of us were occupying this space, that respecting the traditions and practices and desires of the people who do have those connections to the land.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And to conclude our section on land acknowledgement, but we will be coming back to First Nations justice, hopefully at several times during this presentation and the discussion, is that we warmly welcome any First Nations people who are here with us today. We invite you to bring your full self and our respect to elders past, present and emerging. Okay, everyone, the beginning of this session is going to be a little bit presentation style while we lay the groundwork to be able to do some really deep work in anti-racist practice in a very short time of an hour and a half. So the first thing I want to note is that the arts are incredible. The arts are enriching and amazing, and I buy into the transformative powers of the arts. That's one of the reasons why I'm an artist and an arts educator and a teaching artist. And they can also be spaces for oppression. So often we talk about the arts as being these liberating force that's able to bring about empathy and tolerance and break down barriers between communities and build understanding between all humans. And I believe that, I firmly believe that. But we have to acknowledge that there is also sites of the arts that are sites of oppression. So as an example, in the Western world, the Western conception of what we know about the arts largely began in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment period. And I've got a little montage here of some things that were considered great art and good art. And where I live, our education system is still very much designed around this conception of art. And things are changing slowly, but this is embedded into arts curriculum and arts practice in so many places. These arts that we have here, while being incredible feats of humankind, were also the justification used for the colonial project. So this was held up as an example of the advancement of humankind, and that was used as an excuse to go into countries and steal and loot and commit acts of genocide, and the repercussions of which we are still living with today. So the arts are not automatically sites of liberation. Liberation isn't inherent to the arts. It is something that we absolutely have to work towards. I want to place some limitations on the session today. So this, firstly, that everyone enters from a different point on their anti-racist journey. Everybody is on a continuum. The work is never complete. This should not be considered the end point of your journey in anti-racist practice. It is perhaps the beginning or the middle, but it is never the end point, because we are never finished with this work. It requires ongoing work. We are not going to be able to solve all of racism today. In fact, nobody and no one thing, no one force can be expected to do that. This is a starting point. At some stages, you might have uncomfortable feelings about some of the discussions that we engage in. We invite you to sit with those feelings and examine where the uncomfortable feelings come from. We welcome people from all over the world. The examples that we're going to use are from our context. For Rachel and I, that is in Australia. For Carla, that is in the United States. So we are drawing upon our experience, but that is not supposed to be exclusionary of where you are, of your geographic or cultural location as well. We do invite you to assess your positionality as well, and that is before speaking or before contributing or while engaging in the discussion. So if you are somebody who relatively holds a lot of power, and particularly intersectional power, we invite you to examine that before you contribute and ask yourself, is this a space where I should be listening and learning? Is my contribution really necessary at this time? Am I better in contributing in other or different ways? Or can our community be, very enriched by what I have to offer here? So just assess your positionality, particularly when we get to some breakout groups. There is also a content and a trigger warning, particularly for those people from racialized backgrounds. We are going to be talking about stories of racial minorities and of racism, and this can be triggering for people who have life experience of that. So we invite you, if you do need a moment away, if you do need to debrief afterwards, we are very open to doing that as well. Now, after setting all of that up, I believe it is time to go to some inspiration. We want to start with stories of inspiration and hope, and I'd like to start with one of my own. So, Rachel, if we go to the next slide, Carla and I are going to share some stories of inspiration and hope from our own experience. I'm going to share with you a video about a program that I run in here in Sydney, Australia, and it's an anti-racism program, and it is in schools in my state in New South Wales. This is an anti-racism program, and it is done through my art form, which is Bollywood dancing. Bollywood dancing is something that is part of my culture, but it's also so infused with colour and joy, and I engage that in my anti-racism work, not to wash away the darkness of racism, but to provide a joyful portal through which students can walk through towards greater understanding. I'm going to show a 2.5-minute video, and you're welcome to ask me questions about it at a later stage in the session. So Rachel, you can play the video. Deep Harmony is an anti-racism program in schools. It's in primary and high schools, and we teach mainly through drama and dance. Deep Harmony rests on First Nations justice. Ideas around race start being formed when we are just 18 months old. Ideas about racial grouping harden when we're just 3 years old. It is never too early to start talking about race, racism, and the need for cultural diversity and acceptance. Drama strategies enable students to step in and out of role. They're able to experience through freeze frames, through role plays, through dialogue and improvisation, some of the nuances of racism and some of the areas that are really, really challenging to talk about. We rehearse different responses to racism so that students feel stronger and more confident being able to do something about it.
I enjoyed the Deep Harmony program as it gave me a different perspective on what racism is and how different types of people interpret racism and the effect it can actually have on people's mental health and well-being.
I was able to learn a lot of new things about racism and how lived experience can really impact someone's lives.
Their confidence and willingness to share, willingness to ask uncomfortable questions if they want the answer to that has been really, really good to see. I'm an Indian dancer and I love sharing my culture with people. Every session finishes with Bollywood dancing, and that is important because we've just done hard work, we've had difficult conversations, and for us to end together, moving together, dancing together, in joy side by side is really important. What we're finding is that when students engage respectfully in an art form, they're walking through the arts as a portal towards greater understanding. They leave feeling uplifted, they feel empowered, they feel like they can have a voice and they can do something to stand up to racism. Deep Harmony is just the start, but what we are seeing is students mixing amongst cultures more easily, students more open to having conversations with students that they don't normally mix with. We see students coming together to have difficult conversations in a way that they tell us they haven't done before. We have students telling their own personal stories. The hope is that what students learn during Deep Harmony is able to carry through their schooling and of course throughout their life. Thank you so much for playing that, Rachel, and thank you everyone for listening to that video. That project was supported by the Australia Council for the Arts. I'm now going to hand over to Carla to give us her snapshot of hope and practice.
I love that video. It's lovely. So I want to set the stage a little bit about Chicago and Chicago theater. And the arts in Chicago writ large. And this may resonate with some folks within their own geography, but I just want to provide a little bit of context before we dive in. So this amazing group of people are folks that I worked with back in 2019 before I became the executive director of Free Street Theater. Free Street Theater, in this photo, we were on the brink of turning 50 as a theater company. And Free Street does devise theater that is by, for, about, with, and in Chicago's communities. Free Street is a free or pay what you can theater company. So nobody gets turned away to experience their shows. And Free Street aims to disrupt both the economic and the geographic segregation that exists in the city. Chicago is known to be one of the most racially segregated cities in the United States, if not in the world. So to that end, Free Street was really brought on in 1969 after a moment of deep racial unrest to help bring the city back together. And how Free Street does that is that they provide free, accessible plays and theatrical pieces that are done not only in conjunction with, but we actually would bring on folks that weren't necessarily seen as professional, seasoned performers. So what you see here are members of every single ward in the city of Chicago. Not every neighborhood. Chicago is divided by 50 geographic wards that are then governed in different ways. And so to that end, we did, for our 50th anniversary, we performed 50 plays in all of Chicago's 50 wards in one day. And this was the group of artists that brought that together. What is really, really special about that moment, and what was really special about Free Street, and what this moment symbolized for me, and what I take with me now in my work as the Executive Director of Arts Administrators of Color, is this notion that we want to be seen in our work. Culturally affirming work, geographically affirming work. And we want our stories to be reflected in every facet of the zeitgeist and of the culture. What I thought was really interesting, Rachel, about the image that you shared earlier about art is about, how fine art, which I have a really big problem with in terms of that word fine art, but how art was defined and how it became professionalized, and who got to deem certain pieces of art as good art, as professional art, and in the case in the United States, art that is worth funding. Because in Chicago as well, arts dollars are really concentrated in the widest and the richest parts of the city. And so here, in a space filled with members and residents of every single ward in the city of Chicago, over the course of 3 weeks, we were able to collectively put together stories that were reflective of each of those communities. And from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m., on a June day in 2019, we deployed every single one of these groups to perform, and all came together at the end. And we were very tired, and it rained a whole lot. But what was wonderful about this moment, and what continues to be really wonderful about the work that Free Street does, is that it is not done in a prescriptive way. It is not, we know there to be violence in Chicago. We know that certain communities don't have access or advantage. So we're going to come in and swoop in and save this neighborhood by bringing them something that may not be so resonant. The other thing that Free Street does is that with every production that they do, is that they partner with a community-based organization that is doing work on the ground every day. And so we work together to amplify what is happening within those communities so that they also get some love, because they're the people who are there every single day doing that work. For example, there was a play about environmental racism that Free Street produced both in 2019 and most recently as the first live show in 2023 called Wasted. And the community partner was a Little Village environmental justice organization. The Little Village community in Chicago is known to really have been deeply affected by the way that industry has really decimated that community, both from an air quality perspective and in other ways. So all of that to say, I was the executive director of this organization for 3 years. It was during the pandemic, but even then, the work never stopped. And what I mean by that is, it then became, how do we continue to fund these artists? How do we continue to keep them employed? How do we continue to keep these narratives out there? Because if we weren't doing that, and if we weren't creating equitable wages over, at a time when live theater was really deeply affected and impacted and still is, then we would lose all of these stories. We would lose these really, really important narratives. And that was something that Free Street did not want to let go of. And so I remain inspired by the work that Free Street does and continues to do. And even after, I've been gone from there almost a year. But even now, I still take that very, very important lesson, which is, if I'm not from that community, how do we enter it? How do we engage with what is already happening? Because this notion that communities are operating in a deficit and not in abundance is actually quite often a wrong assumption. And we'll move into some wrong assumptions in a moment.
Thank you, Carl. It's so inspirational to hear you talk about that work and those spaces. If you'll continue with, those wrong approaches, I guess, to set up ways of working.
Absolutely. So before I became executive director of Free Street, when I was actually part of that project, the 50 and 50 project, I was working at an organization that identifies itself as a backbone organization for arts education in the city of Chicago. And among the breadth of the work that they do, both in advocacy and policy, in professional learning, in funding, and in other ways, that organization, at the time that I was there, was predominantly white and white led, and I was what I call myself this, to this day, is I'm a scrappy kid from Chicago that came up in the streets and was really, of course, there was what I learned from my family, but truly from an artistic perspective, and even from my work as a teaching artist and throughout my career, my biggest learning came from what was already happening in our communities. And so before I left that organization, I noticed that a lot of their connections were what we call grass tops instead of grassroots. And they really enjoyed being there. And I was also, instructed to remain at the grass tops, even though for me, it's what's happening at the grassroots that really allows us to understand what the needs of communities are. And so I think it was perhaps the mayor's office and the city colleges of Chicago said, oh, we have this space, and this community, the Inglewood community, really has nothing going on, and we really want to create some programming or some sort of intervention that really changes the landscape and how that community works. So in that room, and I wasn't even in that room, but in that room was the organizational leadership. And they had lots and lots of giant Post-it paper with all of these lists and all of these ways of doing things and all of these people at the grass tops who they wanted to engage in this conversation. But there wasn't one moment where I observed or heard them asking, well, what's already happening there? Who's doing what there? What kinds of cultural activities are happening where, where these spaces could actually become a resource? How are we partnering with, the culture that is already engaged and already consistent happening? When we performed at Free Street, particularly in this 50 and 50, we were in grocery store parking lots. We were in parks. We were in all of these different places. And even now, when you ask certain members in Chicago South and West Side where culture happens, it's at the flea market. Sometimes it's at a church. And sometimes it's an old woman telling stories on her porch, right? And beyond. And there are a lot of itinerant theater companies, a lot of different arts organizations and folks that don't have space. So why aren't we tapping that first? And so it was one of those moments that for me, let me know I'm really in the wrong place. And unfortunately, what happens is that these are the organizations that also receive a lot of funding to experiment on potential solutions when the solutions are, quite frankly, living in communities that and are existing, but not thriving because the money is going to people who are trying and who are trying to ideate, and they're not even making that critical connection between communities and community leaders, which I think is a whole lot of nonsense.
And that's a whole lot of nonsense, isn't it, Carla? I think there's so much in what you've just mentioned. And I also want to acknowledge an education researcher, Michael Apple, who is a white man, but says we are so willing to experiment, and you use the word experiment, on minorities. And he has mentioned so many different minorities, including racialized minorities, including financially disadvantaged. He said we're so willing to experiment. And when will these communities be seen as thriving rather than sites that are open to, experiments of practice that hasn't been established or or quality assured or anything like that. So thank you so much. Everyone, I hope that has provided some prompts for you, and we're going to go into an activity now, and we invite you warmly to participate in this activity. We have a prompt for you, and this activity comes from a strategy that I've used in Deep Harmony, which was the anti-racism program you watched the video about. And this strategy is called Wrong Answers Only. My students invented this strategy. This is not my invention. We were role-playing responses to racism. I got them into pairs, a nice, easy role play about ways that you respond. And one of the students said, this is actually really hard. And I said, yeah, it's definitely challenging. They said, I know not what not to do, but I can't put it into words what I should do. And I said, and they said, yeah, it's like wrong answers only, which is a trend on places like TikTok and, on a whole lot of reels and stuff like that, and media that they're familiar with. So I said, okay, well, let's try that. Let's have a discussion, but you can only use wrong answers. And they absolutely loved it. They started laughing. It injected fun and joy, but it was really, really clear to see what we shouldn't do. So we're going to try wrong answers only. The prompt is, I want you to imagine that your organization or your institution, or just you as an individual teaching artist or an artist, has been asked to do more to combat racism, has been asked to say, what more can you do to respond to more calls for racial justice? And what is your response? And we are doing wrong answers only. So Rachel Dwyer, can I get you to unmute yourself and you're just going to model a response for us? Rachel, what more can you do as an arts educator to respond to racism, but you can only give a wrong answer?
Oh, I had the perfect response and I was just typing it in. Make sure that all decision makers are white, probably mostly men, with grey hair is usually a good call as well. That they're very likely to have the right answers. So make sure that remember, this is wrong answers. We need to know what the wrong answers are so that we can find the right ones.
Perfect example, Rachel, of a wrong answer. Rachel, can you tell us how to use the Menti? Because I would like everyone, we're going to fill this board that's on our screen here with wrong answers only.
It's pretty straightforward. If you grab your phone and just hold it up to the QR code, or on a browser, you can go to menti.com and type that code in, and you will be able to type it straight in and it'll pop up on the screen straight away. I can see some right answers coming up, and we definitely appreciate the right answers as well. We can determine the differences between the right answers and the wrong answers. Maybe that's the second round of this game. Explain to racial minorities where they should change or what's wrong with them. It's very important that white people tell communities of colour what they're doing wrong and how they can fix themselves. Ensure that minority people are silenced. Don't waste your time doing any research or engaging with the community that you're working with. Save people, very important. Supply inferior materials, perfect. Don't pay people of colour.
Yeah, yes.
Experience.
Yes, to whoever wrote that.
Ask them to do the work, but don't pay them.
Oh, the public panel of experts.
Oh, with the panel of experts. Oh, the panel of experts.
Yes, very important. This is fabulous. I wish they could fit on the screen, but these are excellent. We'll just keep scrolling down.
We have perfect justice.
I love this. Develop a policy, but don't fund actual programs and initiatives.
Yes, very important. It's critical to making any kind of change that we have really good policy and then no money to actually enact it.
So this response is perfect. Oh, we've been doing this for years. Okay, so I have lived experience.
We know
that one.
I'm triggered.
I'm particularly triggered and I'm at a distance. Rewrite History Florida is a good model here.
Oh my gosh.
Post about your project so everyone can see how amazing you are. Yeah, taking lots of photos with lots of people. And lots of people from diverse backgrounds as well. I never knew how lucky I was. That is absolutely classic. Totally classic. All right. If you have any reflections on wrong answers only, you are welcome to write them, not on the Menti, but in the chat box if you have any reflections. We are also going to be in a breakout room, and these might have prompted some responses for you. So Carla's feeling triggered, so am I. There's a lot here to unpack, but you get the idea. You get the idea. The principles are up here on the board of all the things that we know not what to do, yet somehow they just keep happening. And I'm going to go back to Carla now. We'll move to the next slide and we'll talk about beyond performativity. What are the next steps after we do statements of solidarity? And we've got an interesting GIF here, which Carla, you could start with that perhaps.
Yeah. So at the height of the pandemic, when everybody was home, here in the United States, we witnessed, one of many instances of racialized violence at the hands of the police. The murder of George Floyd rocked the entire country differently, in large part because everybody really had to sit and watch it. Where, you know, and that was one of tens of 20 of thousands of instances that have been happening and continue to happen across the country. But this one really became a catalyst across the country, and particularly in the art sector, where so many letters and statements of solidarity just flew throughout the internet, with promises to try, promises to change, promises to shift the culture, promises to create wage equity, to make their organizations more diverse, to listen, to learn, to do all of those things. Funders were also, removing, and this was also, in part because of the pandemic, but funders were also loosening their restrictions on dollars and making them more focused on general operating funds and things like that. And so, so the letters came, and then there was a mass hiring, particularly of Black leaders and Black women leaders within these organizations. But what happened was that there was a huge step that was missed. And that was that these organizations that vowed to move into a space of racial equity, forgot to do the deep internal surgery that is required to really shift the culture of the organization. So we did not see boards shifting. We didn't see an ethos within these organizations shifting. For them, it was, we are going to put these Black and brown faces on the internet to show them we are changing. And organizations to this day are doing this, where their entire staffs will be completely comprised of folks from diverse backgrounds, but the people who are really making the strategic and directional decisions for the organizations are still mostly predominantly white folks. And now we're seeing, after this mass hiring, a mass exodus of these leaders across the country. And in addition to the challenges that they're facing internally with their organizations, I mean, we have had threats of violence that have happened, and other things that have really kind of eaten away both physically and mentally with these leaders. And so now we're in a place where, yes, there are some organizations that are really trying to do this deep work. I want to give a shout out to the National Guild for Community Arts Education here in the United States that entered what they called a portal. And this portal was a pause of all programming, the way that their membership knew it to be, in order to really work from a board and staff and programming perspective to truly understand what it means to meet the arts education needs in the United States and what communities require. And so to that end, diversity isn't the answer. It isn't about how many Black and brown folks you can put in your staff. It truly is about the deep surgery that needs to happen, because, we think about what this beautiful future could be in the arts for our communities. And, one of the questions that we asked in our 50 and 50 performances to community members was, what do you need for your joy? And what do you require for your survival? And so in the arts, we are in this fight for our joy and our survival. And in order for us to really get to that place, some very serious questions need to be asked, and some very significant moves internally need to happen, as well as, within the funding sphere. Like, how are we really moving the needle so that we're not just performing racial equity, but we're actually living that value? And so, yeah.
Carla, what you've said, performing versus living, I think is the real heart of what we want to get to. And I guess to our participants today, this is one of the reasons that we have skipped over a lot of spaces in order to get to this discussion here. At this point, I just want to acknowledge a few different comments that we've had in the chat that were really great contributions to our wrong answers only. Thank you very much. To Anne, who wrote an inclusive webinar as advertised with only profiles of white artists. I've lived, I think we've all lived this reality. And also somebody did private message me a contribution that said our organization's great, we don't see color. So we have skipped over a lot of the unpackaging of why this is wrong so that we can get to the joy and the survival, as Carla mentioned, and that we can get to the beyond performativity to living with this as a guiding value and principle. And we've had another comment saying, Carla, so agree with everything that you're saying over here. So if we move now to some more reflections, and we're going to invite you to get involved here. There are many tools available in order for you as an individual or your organization or your institution or the project that you're working on to self-reflect and make some honest reflection about how you're doing with anti-racist practice. Moving away from diversity, inclusion, and equity, which the words are so generic that they lose all meaning, they stop being about the stamping out of racism, and to, more of a generic goal. But there are lots of tools available. The one that we are going to share with you, we do have permission to share this, as do you. You have permission to use this and share this as well. And this has been adapted from a number of people. All the attribution is on the screen right now and has been adopted by the Seattle government, which is where we found this online. And the creators are very, very happy for us to use it. So here are the points which we are going to be considering today. These are 5 statements that we can either reflect on it as yourself or the organisation that you work with. Here are the 5 points. The decision makers in the organisation reflect the community in which the work is grounded. I just want to pause to have a little, this is one of my pet peeves. I think there are other areas of diversity where a lot of work has been done. For example, you would now never have a panel about women's empowerment that is all cisgendered men. Okay, that would just never happen. You would never go to a project about LGBTIQ plus empowerment or justice or liberation without some people from those communities. Yet, in racial justice, it just seems to be a blank, that things seem to be done without people of colour, without BIPOC people, without racial minorities. And it seems to be so acceptable. So this is a point of reflection. The decision makers in the organisation reflect the community in which the work is grounded. And we do have a comment saying, actually, those things do still happen. And that is a good acknowledgement. And I also want to acknowledge that what we're talking about today, we are talking about racial justice, but it does also, a lot of the principles apply to other areas of diversity, including disability, neurodivergence, including so many spaces, class, it's so many transgender, non-binary. We have so many areas where we need to do this work. And I guess we're focused on racial justice today, but we can take those principles forward. Okay, next one. Multicultural audiences see themselves reflected in the work. The staff and the artists feel humanised by their depiction. We have full participation and shared power with people across all races and social spectrum in creating, deciding, implementing its vision, mission, values, structure, constituency, policies, and practices. Those who have been impacted by systemic oppression are centred and decide individually how they want to participate. Each person involved with the organisation, board, staff, artists, supporters, collaborators and audience has agency, feels welcome, included, seen, heard and valued for the full spectrum of their humanity. We are going to use Menti again, and most people found that pretty easy to log on. So here is our little Menti board. Now, your responses, you will not have your name recorded against it. It is totally anonymous. But what we're inviting you to do is to use the QR code or go to menti.com and use the code there. And what we have is these 5 statements. And we're just going to get you to do some individual reflection and using a slide bar, rate yourself on 1 to 5. 5 is to be that you're well on your way to doing this. 1 is that you are just beginning your journey in this regard. So everyone, if you'll just log on to your Menti now, and the team and I are going to do this as well. It is time for you to have some individual reflection. So we invite you to take a few minutes to use the slide bar. If you are unable to use the slide bar, if you'd like to signal a tech issue, Rachel Dwyer, I believe, will do her very best. What we have appearing on our little Menti board here, to my mind, would be typical of a lot of work that I'm involved in that there is that representation is kind of the first thing to move, whereas it is where the power lies, which always seems to be the last space to move. So I did this exercise and I was thinking about one of the organisations that I'm involved in, where as you get more senior in the organisation, it does get more white and there are less racial minorities involved. Carla and Rachel, would you like to offer any reflection on what you see over here? One of the things that I want to add, that it does look like an honest assessment. If they all came up as 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. It's not that I would doubt the good work that you are all doing, but I might question if, where is the room to grow?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with you,
Thoughts
Rachel.
about what you're seeing in front of you?
Mm-hmm.
I definitely agree that there are some of these that feel sort of they're like the low-hanging fruit. They're the easier things to achieve, and we would kind of expect them to score higher because they are things that are just perhaps a little bit more easy to achieve or very visible, so they become very attractive for organisations to feel like they've taken some steps, they've made a difference quickly. And I also think that we see these numbers shifting around quite quickly from the beginning, that there was some that it came up really high quickly, and that was kind of what I'd thought, was that perhaps people who come to a session like this are likely to be involved in organisations that are doing better in some of these areas, and so that was where I had thought it might go, and then it did even out. So we have to also kind of reflect on who isn't here. And that there are a lot of people working in organisations that maybe haven't sort of given their attention to any of these things.
Yeah.
One of the dangers is that sometimes the people who most need these sessions are the least likely to come along. We can only do what we can do, but I'm sure that some people might have some reflections on that. If you have any reflections on anything that's coming up, please feel free to put them in the chat box. Thank you. And Solidarity Ran, thank you so much for coming to join us. Carla, what are your reflections on what you're seeing in front of you?
Yeah, I think Rachel mentioned, this low-hanging fruit. And when we think about it in the context of arts education, We see tons of, at least in my experience, I've seen, and I was one of them, tons of teaching artists of color and teaching artists that come from those communities, and so students can often see themselves in the classroom or in after school programs, etc. But then and so they can bring in some of themselves into the space, perhaps for that time. But I think when it comes to curriculum, when it comes to the standards of instruction, the way that professionalism is defined, what content is being taught, and and other things that require you to have a certain amount of power in the space in order to decide how that flows, that is where we see the bottleneck. And so we have organizations that are mostly white-led institutions that are talking about what the standards are of teaching and learning within these contexts without necessarily, and it is, within the lens of the academy, if you will. And so, there isn't necessarily a welcoming of both the formal and the informal education that takes place, particularly in the arts, which makes our field really, really unique in that particular way, because arts and culture are often interwoven, in the space. So, for me, when we're thinking about this within the context of arts education, it is, when we're thinking about what kind of programming we want to do, or the play that we want to present, or the kinds of music that we want to sing, what holidays we are honoring, what cultures are we honoring, how are we doing that from, in a way that that centers, one, the people who are receiving said arts education programming, but also how are they included in that decision making. So in terms of what I'm seeing here, a lot of this makes sense. And I would also say that this is a baseline for the folks that are in this room. And I think it's also, or it should be organic, and it should be something that we come to regularly as a pulse check.
Yeah, I think that pulse check, Carla, is absolutely essential that we keep returning to it. And all our participants today and everyone who registered is going to get a package of materials. And in that package of materials is the full resource. This is 5 statements out of, I believe it's over 100. So this is actually quite a big resource that you can that you can return to, that you can work through with your organization and things like that. So we have just pulled 5 out, but there is a lot more, and we will share the full resource. So thank you so much. Something came up in the discussion where we say we often choose things that will make a difference quickly. And it's so true, because we want to fix it now, and arts organizations want to fix it now, but is the change sustainable, I guess, is one of the keys. Also, during that discussion, I also want to just do a gentle calling out or calling in to my own academic community. I am an academic at a university, and I have to say that some of these things is the academic community is particularly woeful at. For example, I go to book launches of entirely white writers working with communities of colour, and people of colour and BIPOC people. Their role in those have been confined to data gathering or just data themselves, whereas the actual power is owned and placed in the people who are writing the work. And this is a source of continual frustration for me. These are things that we can change. These are not fixed positions. These are things that we can change and work towards. And we have had a comment in the chat box that, yes, this is good for us to ascertain our position, but then what? Let's go move ahead in the slide so we can talk about then what. We do have a little bit of reflection to do first.
Oh, hold on. Here we are. I was just going to say, Jan, when we get to the breakout sessions, join my session and we'll definitely, because this is exactly the focus of what to do, what next, how do we move forward. So let's come to that then. We're inviting you all to engage in a little bit of journaling at this point, thinking about what steps you can take. So brainstorming for yourself, what are the values of the organisations that you work with? Are they compatible with an anti-racist agenda? In your work, have there been discussions or deliberations about oppression, power, privilege, power disparities between you and participants? And what type of support do you need in addressing racism, privilege and power issues within the organisations or in your own work personally? So we'd invite everyone to maybe take, we're running out of time, maybe 5.
Yeah, I think
I think it's worth
5
doing.
minutes to do, and you know, devise a good old-fashioned paper and pen to keep it quick. Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to move on, just because it feels like all of our best activities were like right at the end, and we have had so much. I feel like beautiful inspiration and sharing so far, and what we wanted to do next was really to get a bit of a picture of the thoughts that are going on in people's minds. So we were going to ask you, choose 3 words from your writing that you feel best encapsulate your thoughts about how to progress racial justice, or perhaps come from questions that you might have of your own, but just 3 words into the Menti now. Treat this as a creative writing exercise from here, in using this the words that are on the screen at the moment as the inspiration to write, and we're going to limit it to maybe 2 to 4 lines of creative writing to draw from here, or maybe you just want to use part of the journal writing that you had before, but to share that in the chat.
I love these words that are popping up.
They're just amazing, aren't they? And I agree with, I think, RS, who said, I love that the largest word is listen. And as a storyteller, this is so crucial.
Reparations, absolutely. Yeah. If anybody asks me about philanthropy, I say philanthropy should not be viewed as a competitive way to get funds, but as a form of reparations for marginalized communities. So bring us all the money. And also the word intentional, right? I know, a lot of questions that I get now in my work at the Arts Administrators of Color is like, oh, you all, want to replace everybody. And it's not about replacing, everybody everywhere. But it is about those folks that aren't moving with intention, and it is, yes, putting more people of the global majority in power and in decision-making spaces across the ecosystem, but also it's how are we partnering with those folks that are moving with intention, and particularly our white allies that are also with this other thing that was written here, which is I can't find it now. Oh, the opportunity to fail, right? I don't think that perfection is a characteristic of white supremacy. So that's one piece, but it is about having people in the room that you most want to have the conversations with when they disappoint you. I say that a lot about political leaders, and it's like, I'm not voting for the person that I think will save the entire community, but I'm voting for the person that I can hold accountable and they will make the shifts. that they need to because the people are speaking. So how are we moving it with that intention and in that way?
I'm voting for Carla. That was
100%.
that was such a perfect summation of of where we need to be going. I'm absolutely loving these words here. I think that what a fantastic reflection that has been on everything we've discussed in this session. It is time to move forward to our breakout groups, where we're going to explore some of these in more detail. We have designed 3 breakout groups, and they're let's use the word intentional. They're intentionally using 3 different topics that might resonate with you. If you don't know which one to go to, let's just say they're all going to be good. If you'd like to talk about working with communities outside of your own and ways to approach that, so say you are invited or say that you are working with the communities. As an example, I work with refugee communities in my work and people who've had forced migration stories. I am not a refugee myself. I have, and so there are certain considerations that I need in those spaces. That's just an example. Supporting artists and facilitators from racial minorities is going to be led by Rachel Dwyer. A number of people have been asking, both in some private messages to me and in the chat, saying, I do understand the boundaries that we're setting up and what not to do and what we should be doing, but I want to discuss more what practically to do. So I invite you to go to Rachel Dwyer's session. And I'm going to talk about recognizing and eliminating bias, microaggression, and racism in arts environments, particularly the things that aren't immediately recognizable as racism, the kind of things that people might clap back at you and say, Rachel, would that really be racist? Would we really use that word racism over there? We can talk about some ways to recognize that, but also some ways to call it out or to call it in. You're also welcome to bring up things in your breakout room that are not covered by these. If you have any reflections on today, if there is something you'd like to share, particularly if you're someone from a racial minority or somebody who is working in racially marginalized spaces, this is the space for you to engage in a discussion. It's very free form. I don't even think we are reporting back. Is that right, Carla and Rachel? It is the substance of the discussion that is really important. Okay, so I'll invite you to now choose which group you'd like to go to. And if you don't know, maybe just randomly click.
Thank you all. Rachel.
Thank you, everyone. I'm so sorry that you all got booted out of the room. Everyone, I just want to say that the conversation and poor Sharon got booted out mid-sentence, and I do give my humblest apologies. Everyone, this was a learning experience for us as facilitators as well, and I think the first and foremost thing that I have learned is that discussion required more time. Everyone's nodding along. We do have a sharp cutoff of this session, which means we do need to bring it to a close, but to say that we really genuinely want to consider these conversations. Our contact details are here, and some people in my group particularly had some questions for me that I would really like to answer, for example, about racism between different racial groups. This is not the end. The next step is that we are starting a working group, and we're working towards creating a guide for teacher artists, an anti-racist guide, and we would like your help. So we'd like you to email one or all of us to say, how do I join the group? And we're going to add you to this group. And in this anti-racist guide, we are going to address the questions that you have raised today. I apologise that we didn't get to a lot of solutions. I'm going to hand over now to, there is a reading list as well that is going to address a lot of the questions that we outlined today. I'll hand over to Carla and Rachel for some concluding comments now as well.
You go, Carla. You're on mute.
You're muted, Carla. Sorry.
3 years of this and I still stay muted. No, thank you all for spending time with us, taking time out of your day or your evening to be with us, especially those of you in the US. I know it's the dinner hour, but for sharing, being honest, and also for being on this journey. I think it's incredibly important. So yes, dive into the materials that we've created, join our working group, and know that we're all on this journey together in different ways. We all have things to learn. We all have things that we don't understand or that we don't know that we don't know. And so in that way, just as a segue out of our the conversation I was having in my breakout group, if you find yourself in a place of privilege, find the way that you can most disrupt white nonsense. You know, and again, if you find yourself in imposter syndrome, remember that what you are not is at a deficit, what you are is at a wealth, and everybody needs to meet you where you're at, and you can learn together. All right, Rachel.
Rachel, over to you.
Oh my gosh, I can't follow any of that. Somebody asked if Carla has a book. To my knowledge, no, but if anybody would like to transcribe Carla's book, you can just, I'm sure you could interview her for a few days and write it all down and hand the manuscript back to Carla as her book, because it's just so much wisdom and joy and gorgeousness in her words. And so that's my suggestion on how, if you'd like to make a contribution and get Carla's book in bookstores, then help her by writing all that down, using some labor. Just a suggestion.
I'm signing up to pre-order that book right now. Everyone, thank you humbly for joining us. I think today has solidified one thing in my mind, is that our field, there is hope, because our field does contain allies and justice warriors and people with lived experience that are willing to share their experience, grow and learn. And that is all of you that I'm talking about. With that comes a question, is that I was just so blown away by all the discussion and the contributions. The people who most need this are the people who are not here. So in our reflections, let's consider how we can tap into that in the most in the most effective ways. That will perhaps be the next step for our conversation. I apologize again to everyone who was cut off mid-sentence and mid-thought. I assure you that we will continue the work that we have done today. Come and join our working group. We would really love to hear from you, and we really love to hear about all the amazing work that you are doing around the world. Thank you very much to ITAC for facilitating today. The International Teaching Artists Collaborative is an amazing centre of thought and progress and justice that I'm very proud to be part of. So if you're not on the mailing list, well, obviously you all are because you signed up for this session, so that's great, but do keep in touch. We'll see you in the working group. Thank you so much to our administrators who facilitated today. Thank you very much to Carla and to Rachel, your racial justice warriors. I'm thrilled and privileged to work alongside you. And thank you so much for joining us, everyone. Have a good day and have a good evening.